Thank you all for joining us. We're going to get started with our program. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone here can hear me in the library and you can hear me on the phone. If you cannot at any point hear us on the phone, please let us know via the chat. Judith Salter, who is a webinar host, will be able to notify us here in the library, and we can adjust volumes or check our connections for you. In case you do not know, my name is Jennifer Creagan. I am the NOAA Institutional Repository Manager and a metadata librarian here in the library. I want to thank everyone for coming today. We're very excited to have our speaker here. What we're going to do is have our speaker speak, and then we're going to hold all questions until the very end. I will get up and make another announcement because I'm certain there will be a lot of questions. So without further ado, I would like to announce Mr. Tim Creagan. He is the Senior Accessibility Specialist with the U.S. Access Board. He provides technical assistance and training on the revised Section 508 standards and the revised Section 255 guidelines. He frequently presents on accessible electronic and information technology and telecommunications. He is the co-chair of the Education Subcommittee of the Accessibility Community of Practice of the Chief Information Officers Council. He currently serves on the Disability Advisory Committee of the Federal Communications Commission. He was a member of the team that developed the revised accessibility standards for information and communication technology, ICT, under Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the revised accessibility guidelines under Section 255 of the Communications Act, published in 2017. Again, we're very excited to have you here. So, without further ado, we're going to have Tim speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tim Creagan. I'm a Senior Accessibility Specialist at the U.S. Access Board. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of the Access Board? 4 or 5 of you, okay, in a room of 30 people, okay. How many of you have I didn't do it. Okay, so how many of you have any experience with or familiarity with the Architectural Barriers Act, ADA? Okay, you've heard of it. How many of you have heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA? Okay, great. How many of you have heard of Section 508 of the Rehab Act? Okay, good. Good. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an overview of the revised Section 508 standards in today's presentation. And technology, of course, is working really wonderfully here. Oh, okay. It must be the parental controls. Okay, here we go. All right. So I have children. They're past the parental control stage because they're teenagers, but oh man, do I miss those days. All right, so we're going to talk about the outline today. I'm going to give an overview of the refresh process, the 508 standards, generally what's involved. I'm going to look at the key changes and issues, and then I'm going to talk about resources and discussion. The discussion is going to be heavily focused on the 2 pages so far of singly-spaced questions that you guys have sent. So we'll just use that and see how far we get. We can always take the questions back with us and then send you the responses. So today we're going to cover a lot of material very broadly, and then depending on some of these questions, we'll have very specific answers. Okay. First of all, there's Section 508, the law, and then there's Section 508, the implementing regulation, or the 508 standards, which is what you think of them. How many of you in this room have ever used the 508 standards that were published in 2000? The ones that go 1194.21, 1194.22. Okay, so a few of you. Okay, so I'm guessing that for many of you, this is a fairly new subject. Yes? Okay, I'm seeing nodding, I'm seeing heads. Okay, so what I'm going to do is give you context and background so you can understand what this is and why it's important. Okay, what this is, there's Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended. The particular section where the 508 standards are found is 29, there's 36 CFR Part 1194. That's in the Code of Federal Regulations. Under the law, the Access Board, my agency, develops standards. Then also under the law, General Services Administration and the Access Board develop training and technical assistance, which I'll talk about. And then, under this one, agencies, including NOAA, are responsible for enforcing 508 incidents themselves. I'm just curious, is anyone in this room a Section 508 coordinator? Okay, so we have a Section 508 coordinator. So Natalie, stand up for a second, Natalie, so people can see you. All right. Okay, this is Natalie, thank you. Natalie is the source of 508 information in the agency. She's a contact to help you with understanding what 508 is, what are some 508 policies you should use, what are examples of resources you can use, such as testing tools and so forth. Okay? So, that's the law. Under the standards, there's the technical standards and the functional performance criteria. Like I said, the Access Board develops them and publishes them. And then the agencies provide them, implement them. Okay, so the rulemaking process, the ICT refresh timeline. 12 years ago, the Access Board established an advisory committee. I was the DFO, the designated federal officer. So what I did is I helped run and compile an organization of 42 different standards organizations, different stakeholders, standards organizations, industry, consumers, foreign governments. And we came together and we met for 2 years, and then they issued a report called the Contact Report, named after the committee, Technology, Information Electronic Technology Advisory Committee. And based on that report, we, the Access Board, issued and published an ANPRM, Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking in March of 2010, a second NPRM in December of 2011, a proposed rule, an NPRM in February, and then last January, we published a final rule, which is called the Revised 508 Standards. And that was a year ago in January. And at that time, we put everyone on notice that you would have to comply with the new rule, January 18th, 2018. So, we are now in the period of you must comply with the new rule. So that applies to covered content, it applies to covered ICT. You're also going to go, whoa. So what are some of the differences and what are some of the things that are the same? All right. So first of all, what motivated all of this? Why did we change a rule that was 18 years old? Well, first of all, technology changes. So convergent technology, the idea of a smartphone, a device, a small portable piece of hardware with software in it that could do computing, software, voice communication, research, transmittal, all that. That was a new idea. So that drove a lot of the technological development. Then the idea is that all these different features were now contained in a device. Products went from having a name, so it was telecommunications product. Well, a smartphone could be a telecommunications product, but it could also be a computer. It can also be covered by software. It can also be covered by hardware. So the question is, how do you address these standards? So the revised standards are oriented towards functions rather than product types. Secondly, market forces. Industry and governments around the world are looking for standardized accessibility requirements. So what we did, we had members of 4 foreign countries in our advisory committee. Canada, the European Union, and Australia. And so there was a lot of information shared, and we believe that the standard that came out is very strong, and it's a model worldwide that's followed. Next slide. Okay, so key changes and issues. What is new and different in the revised standards? Okay. 5 things I'm going to focus on. Feature-oriented instead of product-oriented. I talked about that. The organizational format of the rule has changed. There was broad application of what's called WCAG 2.0. Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room have heard of WCAG 2.0? All right, well, all of you have heard of it now. And I'll explain what that is in a minute. Delineation of covered content and the safe harbor of legacy provisions. All right, what does this all mean? Okay, so first of all, remember I said that the implementing regulations were codified as 36 CFR Part 1194. So what that means is we took two different rules. We took Section 255 of the Communications Act, which applies to telecommunications manufacturers when they develop and produce telecommunications equipment. And we took 508 of the Rehab Act, and we said these rules are very similar. They overlap because they cover similar technologies. Where they differ is in the particular rule and how that rule applies. So when we were drafting a new format for the rules, instead of having two separate rules, we combined them, as I'll graphically illustrate in a moment.
Yeah.
So in the rule,
Tim, can we have you pause for 1 second? We're having some technical difficulties with your slides. So.
Oh, okay.
The slides, yes, the slides are actually available on the library's website. Under our brown bag page. We already have them up there.
Okay, I want you guys to take away from my talk today is to take a breath. No one's going to come and arrest you. I am not going to come with the accessibility backing down. What will happen is that people get a sense of the time-aware accessibility is something that applies to everyone. And the reason more people are thinking about it now is because one of the things we emphasize is content creators. Everybody who writes a memo, everybody who writes a PowerPoint show, and you create an Excel spreadsheet, depending on whether or not that content is covered by the definitions in this rule, if it's public facing, or if it's non-internal categories, then you care. And so I'll show that in more detail once this comes back up. But that's really the focus. So what I'm trying to give you today is a broad picture with a bunch of resources. And if you have questions, places you can go, as well as you'll have all my contact information, as well as my colleague, Bruce Bailey. So we're just waiting a minute here to get our slides back. Are we back?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we're back. I'm just going to real quickly, I'm on slide 8, which was talking about an overview of the standards and where they're found in the Code of Federal Regulations. I was just about to make the point. The rule is divided into 4 appendices. A, which you care about because it's the scoping and definitions chapters for 508. So Chapter 1 contains application administration. Chapter 2 is scoping, when stuff applies. Appendix B is 255 of the Communications Act. That will become effective once the Federal Communications Commission has its rulemaking on it. So it just here so you can see what a placeholder is. Next slide. Appendix C is the technical and functional performance criteria. Chapters 3 through 7. Chapter 3 is functional performance criteria. Chapters 4 is provisions for hardware features of ICT. Chapter 5 is software. Chapter 6 is support documentation and services, which is like the instructions that come with your ICT if you need it in accessible format. And finally, Chapter 7 is the external reference standards, which we put into the rule so we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. For example, WCAG 2.0. For example, a separate standard on video quality called G22. And then finally, Appendix D, which is the original 508 standards from 2000. Okay, so one document, 4 appendices. Here's the way it's structured. Remember I told you it's 2 different rules. So it's 508, which is Appendix A, Chapters E1 and E2, application and scoping. It's also Appendix D, which is 508 from the year 2000. On the other side of the loop, the intersection, is Appendix B, which is the 255 rule application and scoping, which you don't care about, but it's just showing you the context. Shared in between these 2 rules are the technical requirements. Because if you think about it, hardware, if I'm holding in my hand a smartphone, okay, this is hardware. So there's two sets of rules that apply to it. Federal agency, when they're procuring cell phones for use by their agency personnel, have to evaluate this using the 508 standards. Similarly, when a telecommunications manufacturer wants to manufacture a smartphone and sell it to the general public, they have to use the 255 scoping materials, but then the same technical requirements as filtered by these scoping materials, which are a little bit different. Right? But for your purposes, just understand what that means. What you care about is Appendix A, C, and D. Okay, that's what you care about as 508. All right, formatting borrows heavily from industry consensus standards. So there's a 3-digit identifier, and then there's sub-identifiers, meaning that something that has 3 solid digits is equal to something else that has 3 solid digits. But sub 0.2, 0.3, point whatever, the lower the level is subservient to the whole numbers. Okay? And then finally, subsections can have their own subsections. But 5.2 has a subsection of 0.2 PDF exports. That's just the structure. And the reason you care is because it's hierarchical. So that way, if somebody tries to argue with you that 103 is more important than 104, that's debatable because they're covering 2 different topics. Well, 103.2 is subservient to 103 because it's a child in statutory interpretation. Okay? All right. Next thing we're doing is we're broadly applying the WCAG 2.0 success criteria. What this stands for is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a 2nd edition, 2.0, and it has different levels of strictness for its criteria. There's level A, there's double A, and there's level AAA. Well, all we care about is level A and AA success criteria. It covers web content. It covers non-web documents, so materials that would be among the 9 categories of covered materials that I'm going to talk about in a second. In other words, they're not public-facing, they're not on the web. And then software user interfaces. The WCAG success criteria are applied to these categories of ICT to make them accessible. Okay, WCAG is incorporated by reference. Here's the whole 508-255 rule. WCAG itself is a separate rule. It's technical requirements which have been adopted in 508. And it has 3 types of technical requirements. Only 2 of those are going to be covered by 508. The AAAs are aspirational. They're nice to have, but they're not required. All right. Okay. All right, so the WCAG 2 success criteria are incorporated by reference. Now, chapters 1 and 2, chapter 1 is definitions, chapter 2 is scoping. So the way scoping works, scoping identifies a topic or an area and says, for more information about this, go here within the rule. So the rule, which I'm holding up in my hand, the relevant part is about 20 pages, and it's sequential. You start on chapter 1 and you work your way through. It's not like the prior 508 standard, you could kind of skip around, because you really need to read the scoping and say, okay, in the scoping chapters for content, for example, where does WCAG come up? So WCAG is referenced in provisions E205.4, so it's the standard that's going to be used for electronic content, making your public-facing web content accessible, as well as your internal 9 categories of official agency communications. You use the WCAG 2.0 success criteria to make that content accessible. Similarly, when it comes to software under E207, you use WCAG as the accessibility standard you use to make that content accessible. So the way the standard is set up, it tells you what you're dealing with, electronic content. And then it says,
electronic content will be made accessible using the following standard, which is WCAG. Then it will refer you for further information. Software is covered under Chapter 4. Chapter 5, software. Oh, this was an earlier version. Chapter 4 is hardware, which WCAG doesn't apply to. But in Chapter 2, it's saying, okay, WCAG applies to content, it applies to software. Then go to Chapter 5, and you see WCAG is also required in content creation and editing. And in Chapter 6, when you have support documentation, you make it accessible using WCAG. Okay, so covered content. Okay, covered electronic content. This is the one that's probably causing you the most anxiety. Because before, there was this idea like, well, I know that everything an agency puts out on its public-facing website is supposed to be accessible, right? Members of the public should have access to everything. So it's everything on our agency website. That's everything in our social media. That's all those Twitter feeds, all those YouTube pages. All of that needs to be accessible. Well, that was always pretty straightforward. What wasn't so clear was, what about all the content we create in this agency every day? Does every single piece of information that I create have to be accessible? And for those of you who worked with the prior standards, you may recall, for example, when it came to whether or not you had to caption an audio describe multimedia, there was always the example given, well, we're not including someone's retirement party. But if it's something related to the agency mission, then it has to be captioned. The 508 standards apply. But coming back to this, what we do now is we explain what exactly the content is that's covered. So if it's E2R 5.2 scoping chapter, public-facing electronic content shall conform to the 508 standards. And you should use WCAG 2.0 to achieve that. 2, if it's an agency official communication, then it applies. Now here's how it works. First of all, the content is not public-facing. It's one of 9 categories of agency official communications, and there's an exception for National Archives. Let's take a look. Okay, so agency official communications. Here's the 9 categories. An emergency notification. So an example would be you're sitting at your workstation and something pops up on screen and says, evacuation, you have to leave the premises. Okay, that emergency notification should be made accessible. That's an example of an agency official communication. Okay, it's not public facing, it's agency official communication, you have to make it accessible. Similarly, initial or final decision adjudicating administrative claim or proceeding, say internal or external program or policy announcement. The Commissioner of IRS reminds everybody that there's going to be an extra day for filing tax returns. That's an example of an internal or external program or policy announcement. Notice the benefits, program eligibility, employment opportunity, or personnel action. Formal acknowledgement of receipt. Survey questionnaire. A word about this. When we were writing this, we had a concern from Department of Justice because they were concerned that they didn't want us to cover interrogatories during the course of litigation. And so we made it clear. A survey questionnaire is a very limited distribution type of questionnaire. And so that's a very specific example. A template or form, educational training materials, and intranet content designed as a web page. These are your 9 categories. We also have, in the Chapter 2 scoping, what's called a safe harbor provision. Safe harbor is not the name of the provision. The name of the provision is Legacy ICT. And what it says literally is, any component or portion of existing ICT that complies with an earlier standard issued pursuant to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 as amended, and, here's the important thing, has not been altered on or after January 18, 2018, shall not be required to be modified to conform to the revised 508 standards. So what that means is, if you had something posted on your public-facing website, let's say it was a document, and if it was conformant to 508 before January 18th of this year, as long as you don't change it, fine. You don't have to do anything with it. It could sit there for the next 20 years. As long as you don't alter it, you're fine. So then the question is, well, what does altering mean? Well, in Chapter 1, all these terms are defined. So if I say, okay, I think I can use the exception, I check D, remember Appendix D, because that's the old 508 standard. Did this content comply with what's in D before January 2018? If it wasn't conformant, you don't get it now. It had to be conformant beforehand, and as long as it wasn't altered. Well, an alteration is a change to our existing ICT that affects the interoperability, the user interface, or the access to the information or data. So what would that be? Well, let's say that somebody decides to change the URL on the web page. Well then, that's an alteration, okay? Because you've now changed how you get to the web page. So therefore, all the different features in REDCap, for example, color contrast. Let's say, for whatever reason, the original 508 standards don't say very much about contrast except that you shall have it light on dark. They don't specify any kind of numerical measurement. And so let's just say you had a URL that met the definition of light and dark, but then when you change it, let's say it doesn't meet the new contrast requirement, so you'd have to redo it until it does, okay? Because it changes the user interface for that particular element on the page. Okay, what is essentially the same? What I'm going to do, I'm keeping on the time spot too, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit here. So, original 508. Remember I asked those of you in the room who'd seen the original formatting, which was 1194, therefore here's 1194, 1 through 5. So you had a purpose section, which is paralleled by the new version, which is E101, general purpose. Similarly, application 1194.2 was covered in E201 application and scope. 1194.3, which was general exceptions, was parallel to E202 general exceptions. Same stuff. 1194.4 definitions, E103 definitions, which I just read one. 1195, 4.5 equivalent facilitation, So there's a parallel structure in subpart A today and the revised chapters 1 and 2. Undue burden. Anybody, I'm just trying to get a sense of, have you guys heard of the phrase undue burden? Does that have any concept for you? There's something that cannot be done because of significant difficulty or expense. Often, it is brought up in the context of 508 as in, oh, we can't do that, it's an undue burden. But, well, usually no, it's not. Okay, because when you consider undue burden, you have to look at all the resources available to that entity. So, crying poor is usually not going to work. So, just saying. Okay, so again, parallel structure, 1194.2a, requirement, even if you claim undue burden, say I can't do it, you still have to provide an alternative means of access. Those pesky people with disabilities, you still have to give them access to the information. Okay, so that's what that's saying. That isn't changed. You have to provide supporting documentation. Explain why you made this decision. Then you have to consider the agency resources and look at the definitions and the basis for a determination of undue burden. Again, this is all sequential stuff. This is in the chapters 1 and 2. Best needs, same idea. The concept where you can't get the perfect ICTs, so you go out and buy that which best meets your business needs and your agency needs. I'm looking for any spark of recognition here. Yes? Anyone? Okay. It goes to procurement. Okay? But again, it's very similar. It's in 1194.2b, and it's also in 202.7, best needs. A lot of parallel structure here. Not really a lot of change so far. General exceptions. national security, incidental to a contract, fundamental alteration, maintenance basis. Bing, 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 bing. What we didn't keep was AT is not required anywhere. The exception said you don't need to provide assistive technology at every workstation. Well, it's true, you don't. What you do need to provide is the capability to add it if it were needed, but you don't have to actually add it. For example, I want my operating system to work with screen readers, let's say, but that doesn't mean I have to load screen reading software on everybody's workstation. Well, so that's why we took that version out, because it's kind of obvious, right? And then D, extra locations where the technology is available to members of the public isn't required. So anyway, we simplified, and we think it's more usable now. Want to get more information? On our website, the Access Board website, which we'll go to after this, there's the final rule as well as our regulatory assessment. Our regulatory assessment has a whole bunch of really cool tables where we compare provisions. And we say which disability this particular provision applies to. We talk about which provisions map to each other. There's a lot of good information, also the cost and so forth. All right, resources. We have Access Board resources. So our Access Board homepage, which I'm going to go to and show you in a minute. It has Section 508 standards, Section 255 guidelines. It has the final rule, regulatory impact analysis, overviews, and press releases. This is helpful if you need to explain something to somebody that's like a 30-second elevator speech. What is this and why do I care? That's a good overview because it explains and gives enough details. But if you need to brief someone, this would be a good resource to go to. And there's more material we're working on. We also have adaconferences.org, which has a whole series of webinars on 508 best practices. We've been doing this since 2013. It's very well received. Last year, all 6 of the webinars focused on the revised 508 standards themselves, what they say, what they mean, how they're organized. This year, what we're talking about is implementation. In January, we had a webinar where we talked about some of the available tools at section 508.gov for implementing the new rules. And we'll show those really quickly today as well. General Services Administration. Remember, the General Services Administration, that's the other agency with the Access Board who's mandated under the law to provide technical assistance. They have a bunch of FAQs and best practices and how to create accessible electronic content. One of the things that's really cool is the Section 508 Standards Toolkit. It's guidance and it's for help for agencies and departments. What do I do? Where do I start? What are the kind of questions I need to ask myself about managing a program, implementing my policies? How do I train people on this? That's what this all goes to. All right, and finally, WCAG W3C has very strong technical assistance. There's an overview and then there's resources, all about the specific technical requirements. This is the kind of stuff, in particular, developers will find very useful because it explains why you're doing it and the reason behind it. All right, and this is the contact information. All right, what I'd like to do now, I'm going to go over here, I'm going to switch to some of the websites. Okay, so this link is the United States Access Board. This is my agency's homepage. All right, what I particularly commend to you, the ICT refresh, which is everything about the standards. Here we say it's final rule. And if you click, I'm going to show you the link for the Federal Register version of this. Okay, this is the Federal Register version, which is the same as the paper copy that I was holding up. What's cool about this is it explains where everything came from. And what it does, if you would need to give a URL to something, let's say you're part of a discussion about real-time text, you click on it, this is set up so it will automatically generate a URL in every paragraph. So if you're just telling someone very quickly what this is about, find the text you want, highlight it, and we'll give you that information. All right, another thing I want you to see on the Access Board website is the webinars. Okay, we have two sets of webinars. We have 12 months for one webinar every month on the built environment, which is that ADA stuff we talked about right at the beginning. When you walk out your front door here and you see the curb cuts, in the sidewalks, that's part of the ADA. When you see the grab bars in your bathrooms here, that's ABA. When you see what are called the path of travel through the agency workspace, that's under the ABA. So the two sets of standards regulate access to the physical environment. And so there's a whole series of websites and webinars about those. The one that we're talking about here, 508 webinar series, okay, this is a whole series of webinars about 508. So the one that's coming up at the end of this month is about the accessibility of electronic content. How to apply the standards within an agency, what resources are available. So good follow-up to today. Let's just take a look over here on the archives. We have all the topics in reverse chronological order for all the different webinars that we've done in the last 5 years. So the ones in 2017 are all about the standards themselves. So if you want to see a comparison side by side of the standards, old versus new, there's an hour-and-a-half long webinar on it. You want to read in detail about the hardware provisions, there's an hour-and-a-half webinar on it. The other thing that's nice about it is that you can get credit for taking these webinars, which also makes them very popular. Yeah. So, something just to keep in mind. That's a good piece of information. All right, next thing. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0. These are the external standards that's incorporated by reference. This is what you need to follow when you're creating accessible content. So, when I'm scrolling down through here, there's an abstract and then there's a table of contents. Every one of these items in the table of contents is a live link. So, and then WCAG is set up so it has 4 main areas. The acronym is POUR, P-O-U-R. So, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So, for example, perceivable goes to, can you see it? Can you hear it? Can you be aware of it, either yourself or through the use of your assistive technology? So, for example, here is Guideline 1.2, time-based media. Provide alternatives for time-based media. So then below that you have success criterion 1.2.1, audio only and video only pre-recorded. For pre-recorded audio only and pre-recorded video only, the following are true, except when the audio or video is a media alternative for text and is clearly labeled as such. This is a level A provision, and it says, pre-recorded audio only. An alternative for time-based media is provided that prevents equivalent information for pre-recorded audio only content. Okay, what does this mean in plain English? So, you have a podcast, someone's speaking and they're only speaking, okay? So, what you would say, you look at understanding this as technical assistance, and says here, understanding, intent of this success criterion is to make information conveyed by pre-recorded audio only and pre-recorded video only content available to all users. Alternatives that are text-based make information accessible because the text can be rendered through any sensory modality. So what that means is you can set up the text so that it's available auditorily or visually to someone. So it could be read by a screen reader or it could be played back to match the needs of the user. So this is explaining to you why you do this. Okay, what is the point of doing this? And then they talk about benefits of the success criterion. This is all technical assistance we're looking at. And then underneath, it has these things called sufficient techniques. So what does that mean? Okay, so it's talking about different examples, and it's saying if the content is pre-recorded audio, what does that mean? Alternative for time-based media. A transcript, essentially, is what this is telling. Point is, I'm taking a little bit of a deep dive into this technical assistance because the WCAG material at its base, you know, you're going to read it like you said, it's like time-based audio-only media. Oh, a radio show. Oh, okay, right. And then what is the solution to making it accessible? Provided an alternative text-based format. Oh, a transcript. Okay. So the point is there's a lot of material here, and once you drill down into it, it's rather user-friendly. It's just intimidating because there's so much of it. Okay? But let's move on. Let's move on. This is intended to be a survey course, so we're just kind of giving the big overview. All right, now, Section 508.gov. This is the technical assistance provided by General Services Administration. This is a great resource to go to if you're a procuring official. If you're a requiring official, where you're the one that has to write down what the widget you want to buy does, you can go here for information. What we're going to focus on right here are the two boxes on the bottom of the page, Accessibility News and Tools and Guidance. Accessibility News just contains blogs and different things about what's going on. So, for example, here's a blog talking about the revised 508 standards, safe harbor, and FAR update. Okay, bottom line, why do I care? Well, it's explaining in detail some of the stuff we talked about. So what's the safe harbor for previously accessible content? FAR update. What that has to do with is the fact that within 6 months after the Access Board publishes the final standards or revised standards, the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, are supposed to be updated by the FAR Council. So what that means is anybody who's doing a procurement knows that they have to follow the revised standards. So that update process is still in process. We encourage people to follow the revised standards because they're eventually going to end up in there, but this is just an update as to what's going on. Also, this is something you should check with your procurement department. Some more resources. Okay. WCAG, WCAG, was written by an organization called the Web Accessibility Initiative, WAI. They're a nonprofit organization, and what they do is they write standards, including standards to make ARIA accessible and other type of web standards accessible. They also have a tremendous amount of resource materials for making content accessible. So in this case, I went to the Web Accessibility Initiative page about accessibility of web content. And so it's talking about different checks, it's talking about different tools that you can use, it's talking about conformance evaluation. How do I know I did this right? How do I know that this is sufficient class? Different types of reporting tools that are available, and then contacts that you can use. And finally, okay, so these are the, I just wanted you to see these as a general resource. Now, what I'm going to do now is, I'm keeping an eye on the time. We have about 12 minutes left. I'm going to go through some of the questions that Jennifer was good enough to send me, and just kind of flag you to where you would look this sort of stuff up or where that information is found. Because one of the things that the Access Board is trying to do is we're trying to give you the broad rules about making content or ICT accessible. If you use, so we don't particularly care what software you're using. We don't care if you're using Word, if you're using Excel, or whatever. The principles are the same of making the content accessible. And so there's a lot of resources on here. So for example, I'm going back to the GSA Section 508 website, and I'm going to a link that's called Best Practices. So this is probably, the Best Practices page is probably the most useful one for all of you, because it's got guidance on here on how to make different types of content accessible. I'm scrolling down the page, and it talks about web accessibility perspectives videos, so how to make links and controls accessible, how to add accessible video captions. Then the next section is talking about Microsoft Word, 2010 and 2013 versions. And scrolling down, there's how to make Excel spreadsheets accessible. And then finally, there's information on how to make PDFs accessible. And below that is additional guidance from the CIOC Accessibility Community of Practice. CIOC is a different entity within the federal government. It stands for Chief Information Officers Council. They're the ones who have oversight over policies for websites throughout the federal government. They have a subcommittee that deals with accessibility. That subcommittee has three parts. It has a best practices subcommittee, which generated a lot of this material. It has an education subcommittee, which is where the webinars that I host every other month are disseminated. And thirdly, it has a vendor outreach subcommittee, which works with industry to listen and find out whether industry is making new tools that are going to be accessible, whether they're doing things that will meet the needs of the federal marketplace. So these are examples of where to make this content accessible. So, just going through the list of questions, I'll read it here. It says, first question is, how do Section 508 rules apply to scientific data in tabular or other non-ASCII data formats, such as NetCDF, HDF, GRIB, and DUFI? Okay, so they're asking me, how does 508 apply to these specific types of data formats? And the answer to that is that there's different types of data formats. You can't apply 508 to that without knowing how they're rendered. In other words, there's the data, and then there's how it's rendered. So what 508 applies to is the rendering software. So it's the user interface by which you perceive that data. It's that to which you apply the 508 standards. A lot of the questions, when you think about it, is you have to kind of mentally go, okay, what is this that I'm dealing with? Because remember, 508 applies to the user interface, and it applies to those parts of the ICT where you have to perceive or operate or use something. Whereas if you had a component buried inside, let's say you have a resistor on a motherboard. Okay, so you would say, okay, under 508, that would meet the definition of ICT because you could argue that it transmits or interprets or manipulates data, but it doesn't have a user interface. So you don't care. You don't have to do anything about it. But if it's something that you're going to be interacting with and you need to perceive or use or manipulate or do something with that, then the 508 standards apply. Okay, second question. As a long-term archival repository, are there exceptions or limitations on 508 compliance? Yes. So I said specifically there's a 508 exception for NOAA under covered content. And so what this says, what the exception says, it says that exception to E205.3, records maintained by the National Archives and Records Administration, NOAA, pursuant to federal record-keeping statutes, shall not be required to conform to the revised 508 standards unless public-facing. So, the correct answer on my part is, there's no specific requirement to NOAA, per se. There is to NARA, the National Archives, because what this is saying is, when some agency gives you content, gives you electronic information, data or content, you are not required to take it and convert it into some universal format. If it's given to you for the purposes of retaining it for archives under the law, you have an exemption. You are not required to make it accessible. The exception to that is if for whatever reason you decide to then take that and make it public-facing. If you decide you're going to publish it on your website, then yes, it would have to be accessible because it takes it outside the exception. Otherwise, there's no general exception to government repositories. Exception to agency communications. Our grants grandfathered up to a certain date. Again, The grandfather is the same thing as the legacy ICT. If it meets 508 before January 18th of 2018, then as long as you don't alter it, meeting the definition of an alteration, then you're fine. You could keep it forever. But once you change it, then you would have to bring it up to date. So, are they grandfathered up to a certain date? Yes, until you alter or amend them, assuming they were accessible to start with. Some of these questions, why is the level A requirement 1.2.3 not included? Okay, 1.2.3 is a standard that goes to audio description or media alternative pre-recorded. It wasn't included in this checklist by Section 508 group, just it was an inadvertent typo. But more to the point, the technical assistance that I'm showing you what they're talking about. Somebody who's looking at the refresh toolkit, they're often at the basic with a particular document. So any one of these are just a collection of best practices. So they're included as suggestions and ways to, suggestions as to ways to do things. That's it. Could I talk a little bit about the accessibility requirements for exhibits and signs? Yes. Okay, exhibits and signs. The question is, are you talking about a paper sign or are you talking about electronic signs? If it's a paper sign or exhibit sign of some sort, what applies are the ADA Architectural Barriers Act standards. And I'm holding up another chunk of paper. This is a book. And what this is these are the Americans with Disabilities Act and Architectural Barriers Act accessibility guidelines. And there's a whole chapter in here on communication elements and features which talks about signage. So for example, when you go in the hallway or you look at the signage behind us, there's a sign 2TL1. It's the name of one of the rooms. Underneath it, you'll see Braille. And so there are provisions in here about signs, 703. And there's provisions about Brailling, there's provisions about the style, the character proportions, the character height, etc. That's under the ABA, because it's a physical federal facility, and these are the requirements that would apply to signs. The electronic signs, different story. 508 chapter 4 hardware. There's a provision for under 402 closed functionality, 402.5 characters and variable message signs. So you're in the airport, right? You're looking at your flights. Something like that, except in a federal facility. All right. Characters and variable message signs shall conform to Section 703.7 variable message signs of ICC A117.1 standard incorporated by reference. And basically what it does, it goes to the style of the text. So those are just some examples of signage. I'm just kind of skipping through because you guys had a lot of different questions. So does anybody in the room have a question? Let me ask. Huh?
Lots of questions that you've already touched on some of them.
Oh, just keep going through these. Okay. Okay, recommendation for handling complex equations. Okay, this is the agency that would be concerned with that. On W3C, there's a maturing product. I can see this. This is where it would be. There is, I'm on the Web Accessibility Initiative. There's evaluating accessibility, and there's tools. There's a tool search. The tool you're looking for is called MathML. It has several different versions. It has a display version and a structural version. There's some issues with it. They're working on improving it, but it's something that could be useful. So MathML. Best practices for image placement and inserting captions within Word documents. Okay, remember this would be under the Section 508 best practices. You want to jump to the best practices, and a lot of these types of questions are going to be answered. So alt text should be inline. Images. W3C tutorial. There's a good checklist on the accessibility page for Adobe products. Just Google Adobe accessibility, talking about fixing PDFs, the table header errors in PDFs. Let's see here. All right, question is, what's the best way to marking up pages in Excel and then converting them to PDF from our report? What is the best way to make these 508 compliant? So the best way to make content compliant, for example, typically it's easier to make a Word document, start off with a Word document, add accessibility features to the Word document by checking the menu for the accessibility features, and then convert it to PDF. It's easier to do that than to create a PDF which is not tagged and it's not accessible, and then you have to basically start from scratch. Similarly with Excel, you would create a document in Excel, you use the accessibility checker in Excel to make sure that you've got the features in it, and then you convert it to an accessible PDF. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Let's see. Okay, the PDF checkers, you can do searches. People are asking what are good ones. There's one called Common Look. There's a company that makes PDF checkers. That's a good one to have. Let's see what else. What's the rule for embedding URLs or hot links in text? Okay, so this is under the realm of kind of stories that people think are true, but they're really not. Just like, I remember one time somebody told me, oh, well, you know, there's a rule for all text. It can't be more than 32 characters long. Yeah. Said, really, where does it say that? It doesn't say that anywhere. There's nothing in any of the 508 guidance that says there's a specific limit on alt text. What it says, it should be descriptive. But it doesn't say how long it is, and it doesn't say what format you should use or any of that. So some of this is agency guidance. Agencies may have best practices they want people to follow, but that's unique to that agency. Because I'm making a distinction between what the rule says and what your workplace may require you to do. Similarly, let's see, after we talk about the PDF checkers. Okay, so character encoding. What if you only have the PDF? Is there a fix? Now, like I said before, it takes a lot of hard work to take an inaccessible PDF and fix it. Again, you're better off creating a document in Word, checking for accessibility features, and then converting it to a PDF. Question here about nesting. Okay, what this is talking about is headings. When you have headings on pages, the headings are hierarchical. So, you know, there's the top heading, second, and so forth. The question is how to nest them. Well, again, do it in Word. Make sure it's accessible. There is some technical assistance on these pages that I pointed out to you. There's a particularly good one about, in the best practice library, about features on web pages. So these are all good to look at. Let me just see, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm a little bit over here, so let me just see if there's anything else. Oh, are there any online websites available to check a site for 508 compliance? Yes. There's a web tool. All right, so let's just see. So there's a website called WebAIM, which is really good. Has a lot of good content. For those of you online, it's wadaim.org. They have a lot of good technical assistance on accessibility. Down in the right-hand corner here, they have the Wave Accessibility Evaluation Tool. So I'm just curious, what's the website for NOAA? www.noaa.gov. All right, let's see what happens. Okay. All right, so this is a Wave automated reporting tool for the NOAA homepage, and it's kind of hard to see, but according to this, you guys have 2 errors on your home website. Uh-oh. So let's see what they are. Marked in red. Okay, these are those ones I love where it's really hard to find them. All right, so see, the other thing about these accessibility tools is sometimes they give you results where you can't figure out where the error is. Like, for example, it's loaded things as an alert. So, okay. So, H1, missing first level heading. a page does not have a first level heading. And you're like, okay, so what does that mean? Click on more information on the left. It says, first level heading, what it means. The page does not have a first level heading. Why it matters. Headings facilitate page navigation for users with assistive technology. They also provide semantic and visual meaning and structure to the document. How you fix it, you have to put in a header 1 element. This is what's known as HTML5, Hypertext Markup Language 5. Let me just see, for those of you who are ambitious, there is a really good course. Alright, it's free, okay, for HTML. It's under the w3schools.com. It's w3schools.com. For those of you who are thinking about becoming trusted testers, when they revise the trusted tester program for DHS later this year, understanding HTML is a requirement. So I recommend, they recommend that you be familiar with HTML5, which is very useful here. I'm sort of getting the eye. I'm just going to take a look, see if there's any other quick questions I can answer. Okay, so here's one example. Somebody says, I have a situation where I want to do click to enlarge, and I want to provide an enlarged view of an image on a website. Is it better to have a modal using some bootstrap? A modal is like essentially something that appears on top of the existing web page. It's like an enlargement of the picture. That's good. It's essentially a widget using a script. The problem is, in order to do this, you have to understand ARIA, which not that many people are that familiar with. Another alternative way to do this is go to a separate standalone page. Well, a separate standalone page may be easier because you just have to code it in HTML. And more people understand HTML than understand ARIA. The point I've just made with this illustration, either choice is acceptable. It's just a question of being aware, do I know how to do this? Does this make sense? Sometimes you make a decision based on what you can accomplish in a reasonable amount of time, as long as it meets the accessibility requirements. That's one of the cool things about 508, is that the requirements are fairly broad. How you achieve them, given each specific type of technology or each type of application, varies. Okay, you can have different solutions in different situations. Finally, I love this question. Procurement. A typical laser pointer is available for $30, but manufacturers won't provide a VPAT. Must I purchase a $145 pointer because they don't provide a VPAT? Okay, so this is a great question because it combines a bunch of things. It's combining definitions, it's combining procurement, and it's combining an open inquiry. So if I have to buy something that has a VPAT, so I have to apply it to ICT. So the first question I ask myself is a laser printer ICT? Okay, definition of ICT under E103.4 in the standard says, information technology is information technology and other equipment, systems, technologies, or processes for which the principal function is the creation, manipulation, storage, display, receipt, or transmission of electronic data and information, as well as other associated content. A laser pointer is basically a glorified flashlight. That's not ICT. It doesn't meet the definition. Therefore, you don't need to worry about a VPAT. Therefore, you can go buy the $30 laser printer. But see how you use the analysis? What you do is you go to the rules and say, first of all, do I even need to worry about this? Is this covered by these rules? So remember, is it ICT? And then secondly, is it electronic content that I need to worry about? Does it meet one of my 9 official categories of non-public facing content? Great. If it doesn't, 508 doesn't apply. Other laws may apply. 501, accessibility for coworkers. 504, accessibility for others as an accommodation. But it wouldn't be 508. Right? I think that's about, and then there's one last question. This is talking about HTML, what are called presentation elements. For those of you Okay, HTML, hypertext markup language, is what people use to create the content. And it has elements that identify what is coming up in the text. So the question was the bold element versus the strong element. Which is the best to use when you only want visual boldness to highlight text, but you don't want to emphasize when pronounced by a screen reader? Well, here's the problem. What they're asking about is, I want to code some content on my accessible web page or my accessible content so that when a screen reader reads it, the screen reader will not emphasize certain phrases. I want to code that. Well, the problem with that is you can't do that because the emphasis or the way in which a screen reader reads something is dictated by, it's a setting on the AT itself. It's something that the user sets, not the developer. So this question is kind of asking the wrong thing. You really can't do that. So what you would do is you would just use what is called the semantic element. A semantic element is just a type of HTML which is descriptive. So if the word strong means emphasis or strong. So a strong element, if you describe it as strong enough, that's a descriptive or a semantic element because it explains the meaning. Similarly, the other example this person gave was they were looking at M versus EM element. And what it has to do with image. And so again, the same thing, you use that HTML language, which is more descriptive. Okay, so I think we're at our time. Does anybody have any questions?
We are. Before we take any questions here, I'm going to make a quick announcement, mostly for the people online and for people here. We're going to go a little bit longer and take a handful of questions here. We want to be cognizant of everyone's time and Tim's time as well. If you are online and you have more questions, please put them in the question panel. The system will record those. We can collect them and give them to Tim for Tim and his colleague Bruce to answer at a later date. If you're here, please feel free to stay and ask some questions. Tim has been gracious enough to say he'd stay a little bit later. Or you can always submit more questions via the Google form we had sent out, or you can email the library directly at library.reference@noaa.gov, and we will also collect all of those. So we can take a few questions here. If you need to sign off on the webinar, feel free to. We're going to keep recording for a little bit longer, so the answers to some of these questions will be on the recording, which will be posted on the library's website. So.
Yes, did you have a question?
I know that you said it's better to start in order.
Oh, hold on a second. Right, let's let your neighbors by. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I know that you said that it's better to start in Word with making documents accessible, and I know in the future we plan to do that, but right now I'm working on mostly PDFs from 5 to 10 years ago and trying to make them accessible. And so I have tables that span multiple pages and merge cells and color-coded tables, and I'm trying to figure out how to make those compliant when I don't have access to a Word version. I only have PDF.
Can you repeat the question for her?
Sure. So yeah, okay. So the question in the room was, she's working on some very old archived materials, which are PDFs of tables, and she doesn't have any source material, just all this inaccessible PDFs. Okay, so the short answer is it's a lot of work. Okay, there really aren't good shortcuts.
I'm rebuilding the tables in the tags panel, but I haven't been able to do that with merge cells that are starting on like the merge through columns, not only merge through rows. Like if it's merged through rows, I could easily just build that in the tags panel. But I can't build it for some reason when I have a heading that is multiple rows.
Yeah, what she's essentially saying, she's talking about the problems she's having with multiple rows and how it's very difficult to render that content accessibly. Again, I'll repeat, it's almost going to be a question of having to redo it from scratch. So the question that comes up at this point is prioritization. And so what we get asked a lot is, well, we have a whole bunch of historical stuff that's been on public-facing websites for the last 30 years and no one's had a problem with it. And now we're realizing it doesn't conform to any of the 508 standards, and we're going to have to update it. And it's going to take a lot of resources. What do we do? So, again, 508 is intending to encourage everyone to have access to content. And so it should be similar access for people with disabilities and people without disabilities. So one thing to do when you have huge amounts of inaccessible content where you're essentially going to have to spend time almost doing the whole thing from scratch, the suggestions we've made is best practice would be to identify all the inaccessible content, make a list of it, that the list itself is accessible, and you post that list on the website. Take down the inaccessible content, and then that way when someone contacts you and says, I want this inaccessible PDF from 1980 or whatever it is, you can then prioritize making it accessible. The point is, on your public-facing web page, all of the content that's available to everybody, i.e. the list, will be accessible. And so everybody that clicks on that list will have to contact some resource in NOAA that will then say, okay, can I help you? Do you need this in accessible format, etc. That's a suggested way to do it.
So, I'm not sure what you mean by the list. I know for right now, I've been putting at the bottom of my webpage that if you need help accessing or reading a table to you, like contact us and we'll do that. But I'm not sure what you mean by a list and not.
In other words, what I'm saying is, let's say you have this report and it's got all this inaccessible content, so it's not conforming to 508. All right, 508 says if it's on your public-facing website, it needs to be accessible, and it's not. So my point is, take it off. Put up a description saying, you know, the title of whatever it is, the title of the report or the context, and that list or that content itself will be accessible. Okay, and then someone contacts you and says, I want to see this particular report. Let's say you have 200 reports. Okay, you want to prioritize the order in which you devote resources to making them accessible. So the way to do is take all 200 of them down, but then have a list describing those 200. So when someone comes and clicks on the public-facing website and says, I want this report from 1985, I want this report from 1972, etc., they can then send their request in and say, they want it in accessible format. That would be a practical way to do it. I'm sorry?
These are documents that are used all the time. So it wouldn't be something that like people get access to on a daily basis.
So you're saying people use it all the time? So I guess my question is, then why has it been up there since 2000 in accessible format?
It doesn't get updated. Like it's something that was made in the 90s and it just was never.
No. Well, I think that you have a strong argument to make that this content needs to be accessible, because the part I didn't emphasize is there's enforcement authority under 508. People can bring private rights of action. Okay? Typically, the remedy is going to be an injunction to make sure that whatever it is fixed. But I'm just saying, it's easier, you know, you got to weigh your cost benefits. That's what I'm saying. So, do you have a question?
So, to develop a website and to have
So I've seen different charts. I'm a webmaster here. I develop websites. And there's many charts that we work with that are not accessible. There's graphical errors. There's a lot of numbers for depths, for maps and charts. And that information isn't accessible. And so I'm feeling like if a blind person is driving a boat and they're going to be using a chart, that information is not accessible under 508, correct?
Right.
That needs to be accessible.
Because one of the things, again, is with the tools we've done, when you're checking tables, once you get below one level of complexity, it's very hard for like testing tools to correct charts, as you've seen, because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my other question is, some websites, they don't seem to care or comply with 508. What is the reason behind that? What kind of penalty are they getting for not complying with 508? Because there are some that don't.
So you're talking about federal websites, I'm assuming. So it's like,
Federal websites, I'm talking
Okay.
about federal websites, public-facing federal websites for charts.
okay, if you blow through a stop sign at midnight and there's no cop there, have you broken the law? If you blow through that same stop sign at midnight and the cop's sitting right there and he yells you with a ticket, have you broken the law? So the point is, in both cases, you haven't complied with 508. The other one, you're just kind of, well, I'll get lucky. Well, no one's going to bother me. Well, no one's going to enforce it. Oh, maybe, maybe not. I mean, it's a better practice. That's why when I was referring you to some of this technical information about best practices, one of the things about 508 is the why, okay? And there's a whole section in here in the 508 Refresh Toolkit that talks about program management, the good reasons why, the business cases for having accessible content. Do you really want someone agency to justify and say, we don't care if any of you people with disabilities see this content, you're too much trouble. I mean, nobody wants to say that. I mean, even inadvertently. So the idea is we're all trying to work together and have the content be as accessible as we can. The realization is this is a continuing process because technology changes all the time. And the content on the web pages can change pretty rapidly too. Any other questions or comments?
So we had a question online that kind of follows what David had asked about making interactive charts available online, compliant online. So how, sorry, we're just trying to find it again. What about making interactive maps accessible? Is there a way to go about doing that?
Yes, actually, I have some really good technical assistance about that. National Park Service has done a bunch of that. And there's a person up at Harper's Ferry that I referred people to who has done a lot of work with interactive geospatial information, GIS. What I would do is ask that person, please send the email to me at 508@access-board.gov, 508@access-board.gov, and I will send you the resources. Because that would be a good thing to have. So,
Okay,
yeah.
we'll also, what we'll do is we'll send that question along with any of the other ones we've
Okay.
compiled. So, because I'm certain there's a number of other offices that would be interested in having those resources as well.
Sure, okay.
I get it.
I think at that point we're gonna end the webinar for right now. I'm not sure if people can hear me. I think we're gonna end right now. We're about 20 minutes over. So I wanna thank Tim for coming again. We really appreciate it. You've been wonderful. Please send your questions if you're still online, put them in the question panel. We will compile those, get them over to Tim and his colleagues, and get answers for you. And once we have those, we will post them with all the materials from today. So again, thank you, Tim. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you all very much. Thank you.